I want to welcome to the program a very distinguished guest. It's not often that we get a former head of state here on the Ruthless Variety program, but we do now. And we've got the 28th Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, fellas. Good to have you.
Oh, listen, sir. First of all, we're beyond gratified and appreciative that you'd even heard of the Ruthless Variety program where you are.
Well, I gather it's making waves in America, and what makes waves in America sooner or later makes a splash here in Australia as well.
Well, we're doing our best internationally as well. Listen, we've been a big fan of yours for a number of years. You're one of the only voices internationally that has made a international resonance, in my view, from a conservative point of view, and holding it down both a value standpoint, international significance, international relation significance, importance in the world. And you've been up to all of that since you've left office. What's going on with you these days?
Well, it's nice of you to say all those things. As far as I'm concerned, I am just trying to be a strong voice for what I think are good values and for what I think is good action. And one of the slightly disappointing and frustrating things at the moment is that what I would regard as sensible centre-right politics appears to be in eclipse. The pandemic was a dreadful time for people who believe in greater freedom and smaller government, because you had governments right around the world, with the exception of a few states in America and with the exception of the Swedes in Europe. You had governments right around the world implementing what can really only be described as the Wuhan plan to deal with the virus, which was locking everyone up for as long as it took to try to make the thing go away, which was never going to work. So look, it's been a dispiriting time for people on the orthodox centre right. But what do you do in dispiriting times? You don't pack up your tent. You don't hide under the doona. You do your best to encourage people to keep going, knowing that sooner or later, as Margaret Thatcher once said, the facts are conservative. Sooner or later, common sense will start to emerge. I just hope that things don't have to get too much worse before they start to get better.
No, it's just so refreshing to hear from an international perspective, because sometimes we feel like conservatives in the United States are sort of on an island, and it's almost impossible to convey the insanity, because you get it reinforced from Europe, you get it reinforced obviously from authoritarian regimes, you get it reinforced China, Russia, and everywhere else. Free thought, free expression, freedom, period, appears to be under attack globally.
Well, look, this is absolutely right. I sometimes look around and I look at the climate cult, the recent virus hysteria, the gender fluidity push, the magic pudding economics. Worst of all, the cultural self-loathing that seems to afflict the English-speaking countries in particular, even though the English-speaking countries have done so wonderfully well for so long. It's almost like we've had it so good for so long that I suppose a degree of decadence has set in, cultural, intellectual, spiritual ennui. Now, I think we've got to shake ourselves out of that, and I hope that it's not bitter experience that shakes us out of that. I hope it's self-awareness that shakes us out of this, but we do have to get out of it if we're going to flourish in the future the way we have in the past.
I mean, I've noticed interesting developments in Australia. Listen, I'd be lying if I told you I was a studious observer of everything that's going on, but notice that you have had testimony on something called Voice in Australia. Maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about that.
Okay, well, as you may know, Australia was settled starting in 1788. On the 26th of January, 1788, Governor Arthur Phillip, who led the first fleet to the east coast of Australia, he raised the Union flag, toasted the King, read a proclamation, and that was the beginning of modern Australia. Now, in the process of settlement, the original inhabitants, the Australian Aborigines, they suffered. Settlers with their sheep and their cattle, their crops, their fences, their houses, moved into what had previously been Indigenous inhabitants' country. Their lifestyle was disturbed. There were imported diseases and so on. Occasionally there were clashes. Sometimes there were acts of dreadful cruelty and injustice. But by the same token, Governor Phillip was enjoined by the British government to live in amity with the native inhabitants as early as 1838, after the infamous Myall Creek massacre. Thanks to the wonderful work of the then colonial Attorney General, John Plunkett, white men were hanged for the murder of black men. And the British government was constantly saying to the colonial authorities, who were then saying this to the settlers, that the Aboriginal people of Australia were British subjects and they had all the rights of British subjects. So it was a story of good as well as bad, and yet today there's a great deal of guilt about what happened, and there's an understandable anxiety to, in a sense, atone for all that. And that, I think, is what's really given rise to this voice. Now, the voice is an attempt by the current government to recognise Aboriginal people in the constitution of this country, 120 years after it was created, by entrenching in our constitution an Indigenous voice, as it's called, to the Parliament and to the executive government. Now, this idea of a voice
is wholly aside from any sort of representational government they're already afforded.
Well, there are currently, in a parliament of about 220 members and senators, there are currently 11 Indigenous people who were elected to that parliament in the normal way. They were pre-selected by their parties. They were elected by the public. There was no quota, no affirmative action, nothing like that. So Aboriginal people are slightly overrepresented in the Parliament of Australia right now. But notwithstanding this, there's this view from the government, which is going to have a referendum later this year to include in the Constitution a separate Indigenous voice to the Parliament and to the executive government, which it seems will be comprised of 24 Indigenous people chosen by Indigenous people, and everything that government does, this voice will be able to have a say on before government does it. Now, the idea that 4% of the public should have a special say over decisions that are made for 100% of the public strikes me as wrong in principle, as well as being deeply problematic in practice. Now, it's not democracy. Now, I mean, I don't claim to be fully on top of what happens with Native Americans, for instance, but and I know that there are parts of America that, in a sense, are sort of Native American nations. But this idea that Native Americans should have their own body in Washington that has a particular say over everything that the national government does strikes me as something that Americans just wouldn't do.
Well, it almost sounds, Mr. Prime Minister, it almost sounds like a separate branch of government. I mean, if you're
Well,
talking about 24 seats, I mean, that's not inconsequential.
No, it's not. And look, when this proposal was first made a few years back, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said, look, it would be a third chamber of the Parliament, in addition to the House of Representatives and the Senate, and he rejected it. It's more recently been described as a fourth arm of government, in addition to the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And the interesting thing about this proposed constitutionally entrenched voice is that none of the detail as to exactly how it might work has yet been specified. The government that's proposing this, the current Albanese Labor government, wants us to change the constitution with all the detail to be determined by the Parliament later. Effectively, they want us to sign a blank check for enormous change to the way we're governed. And I just think this is folly of the first order. I'm all in favour of acknowledging somewhere in our nation's birth certificate that Aboriginal people were here first. But what we're now being asked to do goes way beyond recognition. It's a big change to the way we would be governed. I think it's effectively a power grab by Indigenous activists, which is being supported by the Green Left, because in the end, the Green Left suffer from this cultural self-loathing, which is widespread throughout the English-speaking world. And I think the Voice is a particular manifestation of that, but a particularly problematic and difficult and even dangerous manifestation of it here in Australia right now.
Let me ask you this, because all of this sounds eerily familiar to those of us who've dealt with similar issues in various places around the world. Are there international, and I don't know the answer to this, are there international forces behind this? Is this entirely a domestic discussion? Do you feel like there are international forces that are putting pressure on this?
Look, I dare say there would be like-minded people around the world who would be sympathetic and supportive of this. But nevertheless, I think this is essentially domestically generated. Back in 2007, then Prime Minister John Howard announced that he wanted to see Indigenous people belatedly officially recognised in the Constitution. And from that time until this, it's been bipartisan and generally accepted that there should be an acknowledgement in the Constitution that Aboriginal people were here first. But it was really only in 2017 when a large body of Indigenous activists gathered at Uluru, or Ayers Rock, in Central Australia, a very significant spot in our country's geography and indeed in our psyche, I suppose, cultural psyche. They gathered there and they ultimately agreed on a program enshrined in what's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And they wanted a voice to the Parliament. They wanted treaty between Indigenous people and the national government, and they wanted truth, or so-called truth, which is to say going back and re-examining Australian history in a way which is more sympathetic to the Indigenous inhabitants. Well, fair enough, let's be sympathetic to the Indigenous inhabitants, but let's not try to rewrite history, and certainly let's not pretend that the history of this country is something that we should be ashamed of rather than basically proud of. I mean, like the United States, there are some difficult aspects to our history. I mean, I guess if we're talking about the United States, there's the stain of slavery, which is, you know, an undeniable and important part of the past. But we can't undo the past, On balance, it is the past that has made us what we are. And if on balance we are proud of what we are, I think we ought to be able to take pride in our history rather than being ashamed of it, notwithstanding the fact that inevitably there are some aspects of our history which we might wish were different, and we might wish had been done differently.
It's a fascinating discussion because the parallels are monumental. I mean, this is happening throughout 2020 through COVID with the tearing down of monuments and statues in the United States, the attempt to sort of rewrite history, and then basically by the American left to try to accuse those who want history told as those who are trying to basically whitewash history, when in effect, the history itself is what you exactly just said, is the true history has made us what we are today. Significant improvement over where we began.
And look,
internationally, culturally, this is all you mentioned decadence, you mentioned
a self-loathing.
It's self-loathing. Like
it's just, is it, I guess, is it just cynical? Is it an excuse for a power grab in your country or in our country? What's your perspective on that?
Well, look, I mean, I know America has its faults, but I used to love it when Reagan would pepper his speeches with phrases like "shining city on a hill" and the last best hope of mankind. And not only was that a wonderful aspiration, but there was vast elements of truth in all of this. Maybe not the total truth, but the substantial truth. And that's how I feel about Australia. That's how I feel about Britain. And look, there are other places that you can take great pride in as well. But why do we have this? Well, look, that's a very deep question that we will, I suppose, all ponder endlessly. Is it the collapse of faith in some things which has generated the beginnings of a different kind of faith, a shallower and I think more misguided faith? I honestly don't know. Is it that we've had it so good for so long in countries like ours, and what we used to call first world problems, in inverted commas, now obsess us, so much so that we can't even say that they're just first world problems anymore? I just don't know. But again, the important thing is not so much to try to analyze the problem, but to try to fix the problem. And I just think that anyone who looks fair-mindedly at the history of a country like Australia has to say that there's so much more good than bad. And anyone who looks fair-mindedly at the operation of our society would have to say that the traditional principles upon which it has been built, founded on a kind of a broadly Christian inspiration, have produced societies which are freer, fairer, more prosperous, more decent than just about anything else in human history. And the global order, the Anglo-American global order, which I suppose has been developing over the last century and a half, has, particularly in recent times, produced a world which has never been more free, more safe, or more prosperous. I mean, whatever we think of developments in East Asia, particularly in communist China, if you look at the world in 2020, prior to the pandemic, at no time before in history had so many people been living healthy, safe, and relatively wealthy lives. And that's the product, by and large, of the Anglo-American global order, democracy, justice, free and fair trade. And we should be so proud of all that, and we should do whatever we can to keep it going.
Well, I guess, Mr. Prime Minister, does the political will exist? Does the sort of leverage that you need exist in the country to be able to stop what it is you're describing?
Well, in the end, I guess these things are determined by elections, and how the governments that are produced by elections then go about governing. Now, if you look at the Anglosphere over the last a couple of decades, there have been plenty of centre-right governments elected. They haven't always been as successful at governing. They haven't always been, I suspect, as self-confident as you'd wish them to be. I mean, look at the current British Conservative government, for instance. I mean, the current Conservative government has been in office now for 12, 13 years, but it hasn't done that many conservative things. You look at the government that I led into office in 2013, particularly at the time of the pandemic, it didn't appear to be doing that many centre-right stroke liberal conservative things. Now, in fairness to Scott Morrison and his team, they would say, well, the pandemic forced them to act out of character, and maybe there's some justification there, but what we need, I think, is a reassertion of the enduring centre-right verities. And John Howard used to say, our most successful recent centre-right Prime Minister Howard used to say that the Liberal Party in this country is the custodian of the small L liberal tradition of John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, and of the small c conservative tradition of Edmund Burke in Reflections on the Revolution in France. The shorthand way of putting that was to say that the Liberal Party in Australia is economically liberal and socially conservative. I used to say that we're liberal in the sense that we believe in smaller government, lower taxes and greater freedom. We're conservative in the sense that we support the family, small business, institutions which have stood the test of time. But above all else, we're patriots. We think our country is the best place in the world to live, and we want to keep it that way. And so I would say that our party was the Freedom Party, the Tradition Party, and the Patriot Party. And,
Boy, those shoes seem to fit, huh, fellas?
Yeah.
Good Lord. I mean, that as articulated,
Yeah.
boy, oh boy.
Any chance we can get you to throw your hat back in the ring? Come on.
Look, you're going to give me a swollen head talking like this. Look, there's almost nothing more ex than an ex-prime minister. Almost nothing more ex than an ex-prime minister. People often say to me, "How do you feel about being out of elected politics?" And I say, "Look, I'm a bit like the rugby player who was once captain of the national team. Then you get benched by the selectors. Then you get dropped from the squad, and you're now sitting in the stands yelling at the players on the field. They don't take the slightest bit of notice of you." But you're there in the stand thinking, I wish I was there because I still think I could play better than those blokes out there. Just occasionally, they'll invite you into the change room to give them a pre-match pep talk, but then they go out and play their own game regardless of what you've said.
Oh, yeah. There's always a role for the old Newt Rockney, though. That's fantastic. I love it. Listen, I have one quick question before we get to our final three, which is, I understand that you had a meeting with Ukrainian leaders lately. I just want your quick take on everything there.
Look, I think what the Ukrainians are doing is absolutely heroic. It's a genocidal war that Putin is waging against them. Probably about 30% of Ukrainian military-aged males at the moment are in uniform. The fighting at the front appears to be carnage, akin to that that we saw during the Great War. But the Ukrainians are dead set determined to protect their freedom and their independence. Someone put it very well. They said, if the Russians stop fighting, the war ends. If the Ukrainians stop fighting, Ukraine ends. And they are determined not to have their national freedom and independence extinguished yet again, as it has been so often over the last 300 or 400 years.
That's really well said. Very well summarized. I appreciate that. All right. So here are the last three questions. And these are the ones that people pay attention to here, stateside. Sir, if you could plan your last meal on Earth, I'm very interested in this from you. What would it be?
Well, it would be my favorite meal, which is steak and chips.
Any particular brand? I mean, you guys do the way.
Look, a porterhouse, a medium rare porterhouse, and thin chips or French fries. I think you call them. Actually, I think you started to call them freedom fries at some point when French policy was annoying you. That's quite common. I have to say.
That quite well, Mr. Prime Minister. That is actually, you're totally right about that.
And I respect the ribeye, good marbling.
Yeah.
Your last meal. You're not worried about the fat content. You know,
No.
you got to go for the thing.
No, if you want a fillet, you want a New York strip. Why don't I have both?
Yeah,
Why
right.
not have both?
Right.
I love that. All right. So second question. If you never got into this line of work at all, no public policy, no anything in politics whatsoever, and you look back in your life with this huge blue sky availability to do anything it is that you wanted to do, what would it be?
Well, I like the life I've had, and I've been incredibly lucky. And I don't really have any regrets. I've never served in the armed forces. I never learned to play a musical instrument. I never learned to master a foreign language, but it's been a wonderful life, and hopefully there's still a few chapters to come. But I guess in terms of other things that one might have done, I particularly admire rural proceduralists, they're called in Australia. That's to say, general practice doctors who don't just sit in their surgeries writing out prescriptions for drugs. They do obstetrics, they do anesthesia, they do surgery. In the old days, they were the mainstay of country hospitals, so that would have been something that if I'd not been interested in public life, I would have loved to have done.
I mean, you got a public servant here who actually cares about people.
I know, it's incredible.
I mean, this is real.
That doesn't sound like a super fun job at all.
Look, it's a very tough life.
Yeah,
you know, being a doctor, particularly a doctor in a small country town, you're basically on call 24/7, and you're married to your work, and look, this is true of so many very demanding occupations. At times, the family does have to understand that sacrifices have to be made, and we all say family comes first, and in one sense it does, and yet we have a whole range of duties and obligations, not simply to our nearest and dearest, and as best we can, we have to try to honour all of them.
Yeah. Listen, I thought you were going to be like a fullback for the Wallabies or something like that. I didn't know that this is going that way, or like Croc Hunter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, I mean, we in the United States all imagine you guys with buck knives in your teeth, rolling through the crocodiles.
No. Look, Crocodile Dundee's a wonderful film, but it's not very representative of Australian life today.
Yeah, we figured as much, but you know, we on the show we do a lot of segments on animals and you know, animal fighting and whatnot, and you know, just because Australia is the capital of the world of the dangerous animals,
Right.
I feel like, you know, we kind of gotta ask.
Yeah, no, I do think if we could just slip in one extra question. I know Josh has to get to the third important question, but one of the things that we like to talk about among the fellas is what is the biggest animal that you could beat in a fight?
And in Australia, this is a serious proposition.
Probably a Chihuahua.
Well, one of the guys claimed that he could take a kangaroo in a boxing match, and I just do not believe that for the life of me. Do you, Mr. Prime Minister, think that it is possible for one of the fellas on this show to go toe to toe with a kangaroo in a boxing match?
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, I think there have been occasions when large male kangaroos have had boxing gloves strapped onto their front paws, and they have been put
you guys
into the
did
ring.
that.
I think, I mean, it sounds like an abuse of the kangaroo, I've got to say, but nevertheless, I think it may have happened. Kangaroos are quite powerful animals, and a large male kangaroo you want to give a wide berth to because they can get aggressive. But look, you know, they're not. Most kangaroos are they're a bit timid. But for instance, the Abbott family normally holiday in January, our summer, at a place called Barara. It's a sort of a camping ground, and there'll often be kangaroos roaming through the camping ground, and they're not exactly tame, but if you gently approach them, you can often get close to them and even pat them a bit. So, but you know, the big males, as I said,
maybe give them a sock if you need it.
You give them a wide berth.
It sounds like very smart advice. Very, very smart.
I never thought when we started this podcast we'd eventually be able to ask a former prime minister himself the question of whether we could take a kangaroo. Just absolutely. I thank you so much for answering that. I really appreciate it.
You have answered our dreams here today, Mr. Abbott. The final question, and this is a little bit esoteric, so you got to stick with me on this. Our view is that almost every successful person is motivated by one of two things: the thrill of victory or the agony of defeat. And it's not that anybody enjoys losing or anybody doesn't enjoy winning. It's what motivates you to go to the next step, right? And there are people who are just self-motivated, glass half full, always charging up the hill to get to the next thing. And then there are other people whose one slight, the one person who stopped their ascendance at one level that they focus on, and they try to make themselves that much better to ensure that they never ever face that humiliation ever again. On that spectrum, where do you think you find yourself?
Well, there's no doubt that occasionally I suppose a sense of shame drives one to avoid certain things. But look, for me, I don't think it's so much the thrill of victory or the frustration of defeat. It's more this, I guess, nagging, gnawing desire to make a difference. And if I see something that I think in my guts is just wrong, I always wanted to do what I can to try to make it better.
Listen, sir, you're a public servant to the end. We can't thank you enough for joining it. For all of our listeners who want to follow along with what you're up to, follow along with your international travels and everything that you're advocating for, where can they find you?
Well, I have a website, tonyabbott.com.au, all lowercase, TONYABBOTT, Tango, Oscar, November, Yankee, Alpha, Bravo, Bravo, Oscar, Tango, .com.au. So there's that. And yeah, I guess if you Google Tony Abbott, I think I'm normally the first Tony Abbott who turns up.
As prime ministers are one to do. Listen, sir, I can't thank you enough for sharing some time with us. We really appreciate it. And let's stay in touch.
We will indeed. Thanks, fellas. Good on you.
Thank you.
Thank you.